After a long silt-strided ride, you eventually arrive in the dusty settlement of Aldrun. You walk around the town, struggling to see much due to the ash storm. As you journey through the town, you eventually stumble upon the Manor District, Aldrun under Scar. You enter the building, searching around the old carcass for the council hall of House Redoran. You eventually find it, meeting a Red Guard woman who says to you,
"Talk is free, what do you want?"
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be discussing House Redoran. More specifically, why did Morrowind turn to House Redoran after the Oblivion Crisis? To do this, we will need to go over a few things. Firstly, who even are House Redoran? So, what is their culture and their philosophy? After this, we will move on to discuss the history of House Redoran. So, what events have they been involved in and their legacy in Tamriel? Then, we will move on to who are House Redoran, allies and enemies. So who have they aligned themselves with over the years, along with who have they had falling outs with, this giving us some insight into their behavior towards others. Finally, we will discuss the key players. So who was important in House Redoran becoming the top house of the Dunmer. So let us begin with who are House Redoran. So who are House Redoran? Well, to start, House Redoran are one of the 5 great houses of the Dunmer. House Redoran have been around since before the Dunmer were the Dunmer, in the times where they were actually the Kaimer. This house is made up of 5 major families, these families being Haran, Redras, Serrano, Saran, and Vanim. These 5 families were rather important when it came to the building of the Library of Andul. But anyway, House Redoran has held territory in both mainland Morrowind and on the island of Vardenfell throughout the years, basing themselves out of Blacklight, which was a city close to the border of Skyrim for quite some time. They also have had land in Vardenfell, the settlements that have been House Redoran cities over the years, including Aldrun, Suran, Balmora, and Nessus. However, out of these 4 settlements in Vardenfell, only 2 of them actually are built in House Redoran's typical architectural style. Suran and Balmora were originally House Redoran settlements that they paid House Hlalu to build, with the speculation that House Hlalu would build the settlements in House Redoran style. However, if you have ever visited these settlements, you would know that they are in House Hlalu style. Now, if we look at Aldrun, it as a city is rather interesting, as this city was built around the carcass of a giant emperor crab known as Scar, with the council house being built inside of the carcass of the emperor crab. Around the emperor crab, we see buildings that are constructed in the House Redoran style. House Redoran architecturally is very inspired by nature around it. Their buildings are often crafted out of local materials. The outsides of their buildings have organic curves and are often left undecorated, being rather inspired by the landscape and the giant native insects of Morrowind. Now we should move on and discuss the culture and philosophy of House Redoran a bit more, as they do differ from the other great houses quite a bit. If we firstly look at the symbols that represent House Redoran, you'll see the scarab beetle. It is present on their banners along with on various items of theirs, like their shields. The scarab is viewed as sacred by House Redoran. Along with this, we also see the House Redoran banners primarily being red, and House Redoran also being described as the Red Hats or the Red Party, this being due to the color red representing the party. Now, when it comes to House Redoran's beliefs and philosophy, as a house, House Redoran focuses on maintaining the traditions of the settled Dunmer, the tradition most important to them being the way of the warrior. Because of this, they believe that their military strength outclasses the other Dunmer great houses, which is why they are often seen as Morrowind's de facto military, being better at fighting and valuing strength more than several of the other great houses. Members of House Redoran believe in fulfilling their duty and maintaining honor. Doing anything less than this was considered disrespectful towards yourself and towards your house. This would hint at why they have such a strong and passionate fighting force, with this house being very focused on honor and duty, encouraging members to join the military and follow the way of the warrior. Members of House Redoran believe that life is serious and difficult. It is the duty of House Redoran members to accept and endure the harshness of life. House Redoran believe the virtues of duty duty, gravity, and piety to be the most important. Because of their virtues, especially their virtue of piety and their warrior spirit, we see the majority of the buoyant armigers being from House Redoran. So based on this, why did Morrowind turn to House Redoran after the Oblivion Crisis? Well, House Redoran is known to be the de facto military of the Dunmer. Carrying on the way of the warrior, this was a necessity during the Oblivion Crisis, as Morrowind was not protected by the Empire at this time. This being due to the Empire also being attacked by the Daedra that were flooding over Tamriel. So House Redoran, having emphasis on the warrior spirit, would have been helpful in forming a defense against the attacking Daedra. Along with this, their belief that life is difficult and that they must endure, so through their suffering in the war against the Daedra, the members of House Redoran would have felt like they brought honor to House Redoran. We also see the virtue of piety being important to the house. Because of this, House Redoran had a strong connection to the Tribunal Temple, which would have also encouraged them to fight against the Daedra, as they are viewed negatively by the Tribunal Temple. So with House Redoran being the house that would have put themselves on the line for the people of Morrowind, it would give the people of Morrowind a group of heroes to look up to. But this is only one part of the story. To learn more, we will have to discuss the history of House Redoran. So, for the history of House Redoran, we begin before they were even the Dunmer. House Redoran has existed since the times of the Chimer and the First Council. With this, they were already at that time considered to be the most militarily powerful out of all of the great houses. We would see this great military power as with the War of the First Council, more specifically in the Battle of Red Mountain, which was believed to have occurred in the First Era around the year 700. There would be several warriors from House Redoran who would fight and die under the leadership of the Hortator, Induril Nerevar. Now, in the coming decades after the war, we would also see that at least one House Redoran general be part of the Tribunal Temple discussions about the reorganizations of house lands in Morrowind. So this house has been rather influential even in the First Era times when it comes to the structuring of Morrowind. Now, moving on to the last story involving House Redoran in the First Era. This being the story of Turala. The story of Turala occurs in the final year of the First Era. So in 2920, Turala was a member of House Redoran and was the favourite mistress of the Duke of Mournhold, who happened to be a member of House Induril. So Turala would become pregnant and she would be kicked out by the Duke of Mournhold, leading to her decision to return home to her family in House Redoran lands. However, they would not greet her warmly. Instead, after finding out who the father of the child was, they would banish her, branding her so that she may never return to Morrowind. So Turala would wander the wilderness, alone whilst pregnant, making her way to Cyrodiil. Eventually, in the middle of a forest, seemingly alone, Turala would go into labour. The only witness, a strange bird, which turned out to be no bird at all. It instead was an Ayleid. The Ayleid would help Turala in the birth of her child, then would disappear. Turala would name her child Bosriel. Turala would then continue on with her journey through the wilds of Cyrodiil. Eventually, she would stop at an inn called the Eagle's Cry. Here, she would meet a Breton who was an Imperial agent by the name of Cassier Whitley. Turala would be convinced by Cassier to join him. So they would ride together, with Cassier eventually taking Turala to the Skeffington Coven, where Cassier would leave Turala, claiming that her and her child Bosriel would be safe there. Turala would stay with the Coven for just over a month before she would show her talent for summoning, managing to accidentally summon a Daedroth, along with being able to send it back to Oblivion. After this, Turala would be sent by the head of the Skeffington Coven to Wayrest with 2 other members to collect some potion ingredients. Turala would leave her 5-month-old baby in the care of the Coven and head off. Then, 19 days later, Turala and her companions would be about to return to the Skeffington Coven, when they would encounter who she assumed to be an old friend. this supposed old friend being Cassia. Cassia would tell Turala that he needed to visit Skeffington Coven, so Turala invited him to join her and the others, but they would not be met by the Coven. No, they would be met by deceit and destruction, with Cassia claiming that the deaths of her Coven members, including her own child, was caused by assassins who had been hired by the Duke of Mournhold. Considering that Turala had never forgiven the Duke for being cast out after she became pregnant, it was easy for her to believe what Cassia had told her. So with that, 2 weeks later, Mournhold would be in ruins and the majority of its citizens, including the Duke, were dead. Mehrunes Dagon had been summoned. But anyway, moving on to the Second Era. So in the Second Era in the year 560, there would be an outbreak of the Nahatan flu. This flu was a rather deadly flu, causing many deaths throughout Tamriel. But it was also a rather interesting one, which would cause rumors to fly. This being due to the fact that the first outbreak of the Nahatan flu started in Stormhold, this city being an important city in the slave trade for the Dunmer. Now, the other important fact about this Nahatan flu is that the Nahatan flu did not affect Argonians, leading to the rumor that it was created by an Argonian shaman as revenge for how the Argonians were treated by the other races. This would lead to House Redoran sending a group to Mazatun. This group was sent to Mazatun because the rumors surrounding the Zitzat tribe, as apparently this tribe had caused the Nahatan flu. So the House Redoran group would be sent there to wipe out the tribe. Now moving on to the year 572 in the Second Era. This is when House Redoran would be one of the 4 great houses to sign on to the newly formed Ebonheart Pact. This pact forming after the defeat of the Akaviri invaders at Vivek's Antlers. During this time, House Redoran would be under the leadership of Councillor Mariath, and there would be several issues and rumors swirling around the house when it came to this alliance, with some suggesting that the House Redoran nobles were upset that they had to share command with the Nordic and Argonian people, making them upset that the pact even existed in the first place. Along with this, we see other issues among House Redoran continuing to break out with the Three Banners War, which began in the year 580. Now, House Redoran in the year 582 would not only be faced with enemy forces, but also a strange sickness that would plague one of their own towns, this being the town of Circamora in the Deshan region. So Circamora would end up with the Lodos plague, infecting its residents after a group of so-called healers, who were really the Moorborn cult, would pay the town a visit. The Moorborn made the Dunmer sick, so they would turn away from the tribunal, attempting to undermine the rule of Almsevi. However, this was not the only thing the Moorborn had done to House Redoran. In fact, they had managed to murder and replace General Gavrin Redoran. His Dremora impersonator had made it appear as if the general had seemingly gone mad, with the various orders and punishments for the troops. Instead, replacing the general, the Moorborn murdered. This would not last, as the vestige would expose the Dremora and they would go on to defeat the Moorborn. Moving over to the western half of Vardenfell. As the majority of House Redoran's military would be off fighting battles elsewhere, the defense of House Redoran, a lot closer to home, was a lot more difficult, especially when it came to enemies like Daedric cultists and even Ashlanders. This would lead to some rather drastic decisions being made. This rather drastic decision being that Captain Brivan Malrom would employ Fahara's Warclaws, who were a group of Khajiit mercenaries that were ex-Aldmeri Dominion soldiers, being recommended by Councillor Dolvara. Now, with this recommendation, it would lead to tensions being escalated between House Redoran and the nomadic Ashlanders in Vardenfell over territory both groups claimed. This would lead to Captain Oran Releth getting exiled, this occurring due to an incident that his own father orchestrated going awry. This would not be the last of issues surrounding Oran, as Oran would later be killed during a raid on an Ashlander encampment that was conducted by the Warclaws, this being ordered by Captain Brivan Malrom. With the exile of her brother and ultimately his death, which she would find out much later, Vaya Releth would go into hiding, ultimately finding her way to the Morag Dong. This would lead to her father enlisting enlisting the help of outsiders to try to find Vaya. One of these outsiders being the Vestige. The Vestige would seemingly have encountered Vaya's mentor, Naru Virian, previously. Now, there would be further escalation in the issues that House Redoran faced in Vardenfell, as it would soon be found out that Councillor Dolvara, who had encouraged the use of the war clause, was also working with House Dress to continue the slave trade, which had been made illegal several years ago when the Ebonheart Pact was formed. This would lead to a writ for her execution, and her being executed by the Morak Tong. After Dolvara's execution, it would seem as if the situation in the Releth family was going to calm down. However, this would not be so, as Vaya would attempt to exact her revenge on the Redoran council members who she believed caused her brother's death. The Morak Tong would manage to stop Vaya from killing most of the members. However, Captain Pravan and her father, Eris Releth, would die at the hands of Vaya. Now, if we move on to a different part of Vardenfell, we would see trouble brewing in Suran, another of House Redoran's settlements at this time. Here in Suran, the local head of security, Marshal Hlaren, was actually a rather corrupt character. As it turns out, she was unlawfully imprisoning travelers and selling them as slaves to the local plantations, having them work off the crimes they never actually committed, being mistreated by their jailers. Now, the Scarlet Judge was investigating Hlaren and the plantation owners. The Scarlet Judge would then enlist the help of the Vestige to expose and defeat Marshal Hlaren. Hlaren would end up being executed for her crimes. Now, jumping forward to the very end of the Second Era. This is when Tiber Septim would begin to turn his attention to Morrowind, this being after he had conquered Hammerfell. Now, the Imperial Legion and Navy was large, and it looked as if Morrowind did not stand a chance against them. However, several of the great houses thought it better to try than to just give in. These houses being House Induril, House Drez, and of course House Redoran. Now, this seemed like an agreement from these houses to organize a defense on the western border and stop the Imperial Legion. However, this was not really the case. House Drez and House Induril had different ideas when it came to the defense of Morrowind. They desired to instead fight the invading Imperials through guerrilla warfare. This would leave House Redoran to defend the border all alone, potentially wiping out most of this house if it was to have gone down this way. However, this would be prevented by Vivek negotiating with Tiber Septim, this leading to the treaty, which House Redoran supported as it prevented them from going up against the Imperial Legion all alone. Now we move on into the Third Era. In the beginning of the Third Era, we would actually see House Redoran decline in strength. This coming from the terms of the treaty where Morrowind had to disband their military, which, as you could have guessed, was mostly members of House Redoran. But this would not be the end of House Redoran, considering that they believe that suffering must be endured. The house would continue on throughout the Third Era, which would lead to some rather interesting events, like the occurrence of the Hope of Redoran. The Hope of Redoran was essentially a child of prophecy, which occurred at some point in the Third Era. This prophecy would apparently start with what they described as an omen. So this omen would occur during the birth of a male child. Now, the birth of this child was rather difficult, and his mother, by the end of it, was rather delirious and was near death. As her son would come into the world, she would chant, "Fortune has smiled this day, not frowned. My child will be might in mind and arm. He shall bring hope to House Redoran. Neither spell nor blade shall hurt the man, nor illness nor poison cause him any harm. His blood shall never drop on the ground." After she finished chanting and giving birth to her son, she would pass away. This boy would be named Andas, and it seemed as if his mother's prophecy would ring true. This boy was never ill, he would never suffer so much as a scratch, and he was both incredibly strong and incredibly smart, which is where he would get the nickname the Hope of Redoran. Now, Andas would not be loved by all. In fact, he would actually manage to make a few enemies, as Andas was not the kindest person out there. There was no line in the prophecy about that anyway. His worst enemy would actually be his cousin, Athen. Now, Athen had received much abuse at the hands of Andas, and would even be sent to Rihad in Hammerfell to complete his education, this being due to Andas desiring that Athen be sent away. However, Athen would eventually return from Hammerfell, this being due to the death of his father, who happened to be a councillor of House Redoran. Now, Athen was old enough to take his father's seat. However, so was Andas. Considering that Andas was the hope of Redoran, he would be favoured, but Athen would challenge Andas for the seat, exercising his right to combat. However, none thought Athen was capable of winning against his cousin. Even Athen and his friends were concerned about the odds of him winning. They were discussing how Athen may win the battle when Shadi, Athen's old teacher from Hammerfell, would walk into the hall. Now Shadi had travelled with Athen from Hammerfell to Athen's family lands, and would question Athen on why he was so scared of fighting his cousin. Athen would share the omen. He would ask Shadi, if he can't be harmed by disease, poison, magicka, and his blood can never be spilled, what hope have I of ever besting him? And Shadi would ask Athen, have you remembered nothing I taught you? Is there no weapon you can think of that will slay without blood? Are swords and spears and arrows the only items in your arsenal? This would lead to Athen remembering that he had been taught by Shadi about Yakudan weapons, including the club. The next day, the cousins would face each other in the arena. Andas would be dressed in chainmail. Carrying a blade, he would be greeted by cheering and admiration. However, this would not be extended to Athen, who was dressed and armed like a barbarian. Athen would allow Andas to swing first, Andas slashing Athen across the chest. Athen would then strike Andas with his club, surprising Andas. Andas would drop his sword and Athen would manage to kill Andas without the use of a blade, battering him to death without spilling a single drop of blood. And with that, Athen would get both the councillor seat and the title Hope of Redoran. But anyway, moving on. In the Third Era, in the year 427, House Redoran would be struggling to compete with House Hlulu when it came to the ebony trade. This led to members of House Redoran attempting to stop the Caldera ebony mine. They would do this by attempting to find any signs of corruption in relation to that mine. They would also continue fighting House Hlalu, doing this by attempting to prevent the construction of Rethan Manor in the Odai Plateau. Now this would not be the end of the troubles that House Redoran would face. They would be plagued with issues, like that of the attempted assassination of Athen Serethi. Yes, the hope of House Redoran, as there would be an assassination attempt on Athen, which he would narrowly survive. Blame for this would be pinned on his son Varvor, who was framed and arrested for murder. He would be held as a sort of political hostage by the Archmaster Bolvin Venim. This would not be the only issue that Bolvin was involved in. Bolvin would also be accused of having an affair with Fathasa Lethery, the wife of another council member. This being one of the many reasons why he was disliked, considering he was not a nice man. Who could have guessed? Bolvin would also attempt to meddle in the Naravarine prophecy, doing this by refusing to name an Outlander as the Hortator of House Redoran. This would lead to him fighting the Outlander to the death, and ultimately Bolvin would die in this fight. The Naravarine may have also been offered the title of Archmaster of House Redoran after this fight. And now with the Naravarine prophecy and Dagoth there were many settlements who were actually attacked by the corporous beasts that the Ashblight had created. This would lead to several casualties in the House Redoran settlements. One of these casualties would be Councilman Remas Morvayan. However, with the Naravarine defeating Dagoth and the 6th House, this would prevent further casualties. Now jumping forward to the Oblivion Crisis, this occurring in the year 433 in the Third Era. According to the House Redoran second councillor, Adriel Arano, during the Oblivion Crisis, gates to the plane of Oblivion opened all over Morrowind. The Empire pulled most of its forces out of Morrowind to deal with the gates in their own homeland, leaving us virtually defenseless. We had no standing army at the time, just uncoordinated pockets of resistance. So Morrowind was abandoned with no formal army to take on the Daedra that was spilling out of the Oblivion gates. This would lead to the destruction of Ald'ruhn. Now, with this and the absence of the Imperial Legion or any kind of defense, this would lead to House Redoran stepping up and reclaiming their title as the hereditary defenders of Morrowind. They would manage to raise an army and spare Morrowind from the full wrath of Mehrunes Dagon. After the Oblivion Crisis, we would move into the 4th Era. This is where we would see in the first year of the 4th Era House Redoran Councillor Brara Morvayan Morrowind would lead House Redoran out to Solstheim. This group would strike a deal with the East Empire Company, which would lead to the group of settlers heading to Raven Rock and settling up there. The Dunmer who had moved across to Raven Rock would fit in and become members of the town rather quickly, being accepted by the earlier settlers and the miners. But anyway, moving on, there would be more tragedy on the way for Morrowind. This coming in the 5th year of the 4th era, in the form of the Red Year, with the volcanic eruption of the Red Mountain wiping Vardenfell off the map. There would be attempts from House Redoran to assist with the repairing of the damage. This would be coordinated by a House Redoran councillor who lived in Mournhold. This councillor would send relief in the form of soldiers, supplies, and Dunmer from the mainland who were able to help. This was directed to the hardest hit areas like Balmora. Now, this would not be the only issue to occur in this year, as there would be some opportunists, these opportunists being the Argonians. The Argonians from Black Marsh would take advantage of the misfortune of the Dunmer and would attack Morrowind. They were able to quickly advance in the south and in the east. However, the Argonians were stopped from taking over the whole of Morrowind when House Redoran's army would rise up and fight the Argonians. Now, with both the Red Year and Oblivion Crisis, there would be mounting pressure on House Hlalu, with many of the Dunmer looking for someone to blame. This would lead to House Hlalu being removed from their place as a great house. Moving on to the year 16 in the 4th era. This is when the High King of Skyrim would decide to give Solstheim to Morrowind as a refuge, which would provide many Dunmer a guaranteed safe home after the disaster that was the Red Year. Moving forward to the year 65 in the 4th era, as this is when Brara Morvain, the Councillor of Raven Rock, would pass away, leaving the leadership of Solstheim to her son Leril, who would govern the Dunmer there. Now, this was no smooth sailing for Leril, as he would have his rule challenged on more than one occasion. The first challenge to his rule would come in the year 95, this coming in the form of an assassination attempt by Vilur Ulen. The assassination attempt would thankfully be stopped by House Redoran guards. Vilur Ulen was a member of House Hlalu, who believed that House Redoran was instrumental in the downfall of House Hlalu and wanted to exact revenge for this. Along with the assassination attempt, Vilur would also be attempting to arrange a coup to overthrow House Redoran and take over Raven Rock. However, the guards would manage to stop this. Leril would face more challenges, the first of these coming in the year 150 in the 4th era, this being due to a band of Argonians landing on Solstheim, but not for good reasons. No, they intended to wreak havoc on the island. So Leril would lead the assault against them. Leril would then face further hardship as the councillor, this coming in the form of the Ebony Mines in the year 170, as this is when they would begin to dry up, leading to Leril's decision to drain the coifers and feed the citizens of Raven Rock that way. In the year 181, the Ebony Mine in Raven Rock would finally be closed and the focus of Raven Rock would change. It would become a town focused on hunting and fishing rather than just mining. This would lead to several Dunmer families returning to the mainland. However, most would stay in Raven Rock. Moving forward to the year 201 in the 4th era. This is when the last Dragonborn would appear in Solstheim. The last Dragonborn would manage to uncover yet another assassination plot on Leril Morvain's life. This assassination plan would be by the son of Vilur Ulen, Vendel. So, the previous person to attempt to assassinate Leril. Vendel had been attempting to pretend that he and his so-called family were there to help Raven Rock, being generous, providing food, and repairing the damaged buildings in the town. However, this was done to disguise their true motives and allow the conspirators to get closer to Leril, as this would allow them to avenge the death of Vilur Ulen. However, this plot would be discovered by the last Dragonborn. This would not be the only assistance that the last Dragonborn would provide Raven Rock, as they would also help stop the Ash Spawn who were attacking citizens. These creatures being controlled by a long-dead Imperial general by the name of Folx Carius. Now, House Redoran would seem to have found newfound luck when it comes to Raven Rock, as there would be a discovery of more ebony veins within the mine. This would lead to the mine reopening and renewed prosperity for the town. So based on the history of House Redoran, why did Morrowind turn to them after the Oblivion Crisis? With the events of the Second Era, like Dolvara's encouragement of the use of the War Claws and her secret dealings with House Hlalu and Dress, especially in the slave trade. It would go against what her house agreed to and stood for, along with Councillor Eris setting up his own son and testing him by having his soldier murder Ashlanders in front of his son. House Redoran was struggling with infighting and its own values. Considering that the power of House Redoran was actually waning in the end of the Third Era as well, prior to the Oblivion Crisis, this being due to the traditional sways not being the most valued in the interactions with the Empire, especially considering the Redoran army was disbanded because of the treaty between Morrowind and the Third Empire. However, with the supposed abandonment of Morrowind by the Empire in the Oblivion Crisis at the end of the Third Era, the traditionalist ways of House Redoran would become somewhat of a superpower, as their strong placing of values in the way of the warrior would lead to them being able to defend Morrowind, leading to them being able to turn their misfortune around. They would further use the Red Year and the attacks by the Argonians to position themselves as the defenders of Morrowind, which is not a title that other houses were able to flaunt at this time. So by managing to scrape together an army in both the Oblivion Crisis and in the Red Year, House Redoran would be able to paint themselves in a good light for those struggling with the damage that had been done in both of these tragedies. Along with the help that had been sent from House Redoran, they were able to paint themselves as the saviors and providers of Morrowind. But this is only one piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. To learn more, we should move on to House Redoran's allies and enemies. When it comes to House Redoran, it is no surprise that they are not universally loved. However, they did manage to make some allies, or at least have some mutual respect between different groups. We see this with their relationship with House Dress. These two houses did hold mutual respect for each other, this being due to House Dress having willingness to fight together to stand up against the invading Third Empire. However, there is some issues between these two houses. We see this with their disagreement in how to fight a war against the Imperials, with House Redoran desiring to face them head on by defending the western border, however with House Dress desiring a guerrilla warfare style, which would see the Imperials gaining access to Morrowind, which House Redoran did not want. We see House Induril agreeing with House Dress here. What is interesting is House Redoran has a deep respect for House Induril, this being due to House Induril also being a house of warriors who held similar values. Like House Redoran, Induril were strong supporters of the Tribunal Temple, caring deeply about their religion. House Induril also strongly believed that Dunmeri culture must be preserved, not sold out and forgotten, like House Hlaalu. Now, House Redoran, like House Induril, had a strong relationship with the Tribunal Temple, this being due to the virtues that House Redoran emphasizes, these being their focus on piety and tradition. We also see their strong affiliation with the Tribunal Temple in their presence in the buoyant armages, considering that this group were primarily made up by members of House Redoran as the faction aligned with their values. But with its allies, House Redoran also knows how to make enemies. We see several of these in both Dunmer Great Houses and other former allies, like that of House Hlaalu. House Hlaalu and House Redoran do not often see eye to eye, especially in the later times. We see this with House Hlaalu members blaming House Redoran for their house being removed as a great house. House Redoran having previously worked together with House Hlaalu attempting to get along. However, in these attempts like that of House Redoran hiring House Hlaalu to build Suran and Balmora, House Hlaalu used these agreements in underhanded ways to gain territory in Vardenfell. We also see further damage to the relationship occurring between these two houses, with the relationship becoming strained in the Third Era, which we see with the attempts at sabotaging the Caldera mine and the attempts at preventing the Hlaalu manor in the Odai Plateau. So with this, we do see why there could be accusations of House Redoran being opportunistic when it comes to the downfall of House Hlaalu, as they had a relationship that continued to worsen over the eras. But this would not be the only group that House Redoran would butt heads with. We also see their hatred, or at least dislike, for the Nords. This comes coming from the constant fighting surrounding the border region between Skyrim and Morrowind. As the Nords desired this region, this is where some believe the encouragement towards House Redoran's militaristic behavior stems from. Throughout the history of Tamriel, there has been a strained relationship between the Nords and House Redoran, with there being cases of the Nords invading and taking over Morrowind, or at least trying. But also times like during the Ebonheart Pact, where the Nords were essentially the allies of House Redoran. However, House Redoran were never too loving of their Nordic brothers, and the Nords also felt the same about House Redoran. But they would not be the only group that House Redoran did not get along with. We also see disagreements with the Argonians as well. This being with not only the slave trade, which was Dunmer wide, but also the House Redoran attempt to wipe out the Zat tribe, due to rumors that they had created the Nahatan flu. They did manage to have times of getting along like that with the Nords, where they would work together, like again with the Ebonheart Pact. However, this did not last long. We see this with the continuation of the slave trade, the Argonian attack after the Red Year, but also the Argonians who attempted to wreak havoc in Ravenrock in the 4th era. So House Redoran had a poor relationship with the Argonians as well. Another of the strained relationships we see with House Redoran is with the Imperials, this being due to several reasons. In part due to the Empire taking over Morrowind and ruling over the province, leading to many changes within the region, but also due to their alleged abandonment of the province when the Oblivion Crisis would occur. So based on the relationships that House Redoran had with various other groups, why did Morrowind turn to them after the Oblivion Crisis? Well, if we look at their more negative relationships, we can see that their relationships with the Nords and the Argonians, much of their interactions have to do with fighting each other, with this enforcing the militaristic behavior of House Redoran, with the constant attacks essentially providing training for some form of larger battle. It would provide House Redoran with the ability to prepare whilst they were not allowed to have a formal military due to the terms of the treaty with the Imperial Empire in the 3rd era. We also see that the Empire, by enforcing the changes and ruling over Morrowind, it would set up House Redoran rather nicely when it came time for the Oblivion Crisis, as it was instead House Hlaalu who would cop the blame for the disaster that was the Oblivion Crisis due to their closeness with the Imperials. So House Redoran, posing as the saviors of Morrowind at this time when House Hlaalu had sold out Morrowind previously, would encourage Morrowind to favour House Redoran. But this is only part of the story. To learn more, we will have to discuss the key players. When it comes to the people who helped push Morrowind in the direction of House Redoran, there are several house members that we should look at that both assisted in their success along with hindered it. We see those that would stall the progress in the 2nd era, like that of Councillor Dolvara. Councillor Dolvara would be known during the 2nd era for several reasons. Firstly, her encouragement of the use of the War Claws, who as a group were known to escalate issues, these mercenaries being known to be violent and not follow the rules of the great houses. We also know that this was not her only concerning association. As it turns out, Dolvara was actually working with a member of House Hlaalu and House Drez in an attempt to secretly continue the slave trade when it was against the law, this tarnishing the name of House Redoran. Dolvara would not be the only problematic character in the 2nd era. We would also see Councillor Erez Releth. Councillor Erez was a member of the House Redoran Council in Balmora, being in charge of the affairs of the Dunmer in this area. Erez would have 2 children, one of these being Ulran Releth, who was a captain in the Balmora City Guard, and the other Vea Releth. So Erez would set up his son Ulran with a test to see his loyalty to House Redoran, as there were rumours that Ulran cared more about the Ashlanders than House Redoran. Now this test would lead to Ulran firstly being exiled from House Redoran, then eventually being killed. Now this is what would lead to the downfall of Erez, as he would eventually be murdered by his own daughter as an act of revenge for what he did to Ulran. Erez willingly setting up his own child was not a great moment for House Redoran, and it also indicates that there may have been more corruption within House Redoran than just Councillor Dolvara. We see this with Captain Brevan's promotion after the exile of Ulran, which was through the glowing recommendation of Dolvara. but it suggests that multiple members likely had a hand in corrupt activity within Balmora, considering that Bravan was so easily promoted and those who had worked so closely with Ulran were separated and scattered across Vardenfell. It hints that he most likely sold out and instigated or at least helped out in the lead up to the exile of Ulran. Now, speaking of Ulran Releth, before his exile, he was a captain in the Balmora City Guard. Now, the issue that some took with him is that Ulran viewed the Ashlanders as equals, rather than lesser people, because they were nomadic and had different practices than the Dunmer of the Grey Houses. We would see this in the test that his father had previously set up, which Ulran would fail as he valued the Ashlanders. This would lead to the House Redoran Council meeting up and deciding to strip him of his rank and banish him from Vardenfell. Ulran, however, would not leave Vardenfell. His body would instead eventually be found by the Vestige in the Kudanat mine after he had come to stay with the Zainab tribe. Ulran would die after Fahara's war claws, supposedly under the guidance of Captain Bravan, would overrun and occupy the Zainab, thus furthering the issues in the relationship between the Ashlanders and House Redoran. Now, the reason why Ulran is important as a member of House Redoran is what he could have done if he was allowed to continue without being stripped of rank, banished, and finally murdered. Ulran could have helped with negotiations between the Ashlanders and House Redoran, leading to the Great House and the nomadic groups agreeing, allowing for land ownership negotiations and preventing the violence that occurred. But as we know, this is not what would occur. Instead, House Redoran would choose to make alliances with enemy mercenaries to deal with the Ashlanders rather than attempting to negotiate with them. Ulran's death being an example of the corruption and the poor management of House Redoran that ultimately could have led to its downfall if it had been allowed to continue. However, in the Third Era and after, we would see some good members and not so good members of House Redoran who would progress the house. The first of these being Athen Sorethi. Now, Athen was famous as a councillor for what he did prior to becoming a councillor, this being why he has the nickname Hope of the Redoran. If we remember back to the history, this being the prophecy surrounding his cousin, who was originally believed to be the Hope of Redoran, due to the omen his mother chanted during his birth. However, due to the quick thinking of Athen and his former teacher, this would be changed as Athen would manage to defeat his supposedly undefeatable cousin. Now, after this, Athen would still manage to do good things and have a positive influence on House Redoran. Athen would help in the fulfilling of the Naravarine prophecy, agreeing to sponsor the Naravarine as Hortator of House Redoran in return for a favour. This favour being the return of his son, who had been accused of murder and was being held captive by another member of House Redoran, this member being Bolvin Venim. The Naravarine would do so, assisting in the fulfillment of the Naravarine prophecy. Now with Bolvin, we would see him being a not so friendly member of House Redoran when compared with Athen. So Bolvin Venim would have a long history with House Redoran, this being due to him securing the land that House Redoran holds on Vardenfell. Bolvin would also be the reason why the House Redoran Council would move to Aldrun, so he has contributed much to this house. However, with his various actions, like the affair he has been accused of, his kidnapping of another councillor's son, along with his hostility to Outlanders and just others in his later years, he was not the most well liked of councillors in House Redoran. This behaviour also gave a poor representation of the house in later years, even with his earlier work for the house. Now we should move on to discuss Brara Morvayan. Now Brara was a councillor who took the position after her husband died after he was attacked by a corporous beast. She would start out as the Lady of Margan. She, like Athen, would also support the Naravarine in fulfilling their prophecy by providing support from House Redoran. But this is not what she would be known for. Brara, who at the time of the Oblivion Crisis was living in Aldrun, would watch the city fall. Brara would survive and would take a small group of House Redoran settlers over to the island of Solstheim. Now Brara would manage to negotiate with the East Empire Company to allow allow the Dunmer people to stay in Raven Rock. Brara and the Dunmer would settle in well and would become accustomed to the lifestyle in Raven Rock. In the Fourth Era, in the fourth year, we would see their little sanctuary attacked, however, with Reiklings attacking the settlement, managing to kill 6 of the miners and even the Factor of Raven Rock. Brara would manage to gather her men and defeat the invaders. This would lead to Brara being named the Imperial Factor of the settlement by the East Empire Company. Now, the year after, in the 5th year of the 4th Era, is when the Red Year would occur. The volcanic eruption would also affect Solstheim. The wave of force from this event would lead to Fort Frostmoth being obliterated. What had once stood as the defense for Raven Rock was crumbled to the ground. Thankfully, most people were in the mines during the event, so they would be shielded from the blast and destruction. However, this would leave Solstheim mostly defenseless. There were a few remaining soldiers in Solstheim, but the ones there would set up a makeshift garrison in Raven Rock. This would lead to Brara bringing over some of the elite House Redoran guard as an attempt to fill in the gaps in the defense. If we move on to the 7th year of the 4th Era, we would see even more issues crop up for Brara and the members of House Redoran in Solstheim. This is when ash storms would make life in Raven Rock difficult. Now, Brara, being the smart counselor she was, she would suggest to the East Empire Company that they should build a wall to protect the eastern side of Raven Rock. This giant wall would later be known as the Bulwark. With the destruction back on Vardenfell, many refugees would make their way to Raven Rock, and Brara would welcome them. With a growing number of Dunmer and the progress made by Brara on Solstheim in the 16th year of the 4th Era, the High King of Skyrim would give the island to the Dunmer, and the East Empire Company would be forced to relinquish control over Raven Rock to House Redoran. With this, House Redoran would appoint Brara as the Councillor of Solstheim. More and more Dunmer would come to the island of Solstheim, and Brara would continue to look after them. This being until the year 65 in the 4th Era, as this is when she would pass away from old age. So from what we can see, Solstheim, especially the settlement of Raven Rock, would thrive under the guidance of Brara, thus making the region a safe haven for Dunmer and making House Redoran seem like the heroes after the disaster and destruction of both the Oblivion Crisis and the Red Year. Now, the next member of House Redoran we should discuss is Laeral Morvayn, who happens to be the son of Brara Morvayn. Laeral would take over the role of House Redoran, Councillor of Raven Rock, and ruler of Solstheim from his mother after he heard his mother had passed away. Laeral over time would rise to popularity amongst most of the residents of Raven Rock, being considered a fair and compassionate leader who was more concerned about his citizens than his own riches. However, not all felt this way. We see this with the 2 assassination attempts on his life, the first of these occurring in the year 95 in the 4th Era. This assassination attempt and coup by Vilur Ulen would be foiled, but would ultimately lead to the second attempt in the year 201 as the family of Vilur desired revenge. But with these negatives, we would also see many positives. Laeral would repair the Bulwark in the year 130 when it had begun to show signs of age, the expenses from its repair coming out of his own pockets. He would also, in the year 150, defend Raven Rock from attacking Argonians, leading the fight against them. So Laeral would, like his mother, protect Raven Rock and Solstheim from harm. So based on the key players, why did Morrowind turn to House Redoran after the Oblivion Crisis? Well, even though House Redoran has had several problematic characters, they have also had many who have saved the house from downfall and made them appear heroic, like Brara. Now, Brara could be considered one of the unsung heroes of the Oblivion Crisis and the Red Year, as she would bring the Dunmer somewhere safe after the destruction of the city of Ald'ruhn, continuing to ensure their safety throughout the years to come until her death. Now, if we look at Oran, who was killed for ultimately siding with the Ashlanders after one of his soldiers murdered one and attempted to kill another, if he was not set up, exiled, and murdered for his appreciation of the different Dunmer groups, Oran would have made negotiations and alliances between the various Dunmer groups easier, as he did actually see the Ashlanders as equals. If he was allowed to continue, House Redoran would have been at the forefront of politics and inter-house relations. However, with his death, this did not occur. We also see Laeral Morvayn, with his willingness to put the other Dunmer first before profit as a role model, gaining the continued support of the Dunmer. Well, most of the Dunmer. This behavior is not something that many of House Hlalu councillors could be observed doing. So the positive House Redoran councillors had a habit of putting the other Dunmer before profit and their own needs, making the Dunmer view them as noble and considerate of the problems of the people. So, based on who House Redoran are, their history, their allies, and enemies, along with their key players, we can finally answer the question, why did Morrowind turn to Redoran after the Oblivion Crisis? Well, considering that Morrowind at the time of the Oblivion Crisis had no standing army due to the terms of the Treaty of Armistice, and the Imperial Legion withdrew to protect Cyrodiil as it was stretched incredibly thin due to having troops throughout the entirety of Tamriel, Morrowind was left incredibly vulnerable at this time. We know this as Morrowind was overrun by Daedra, who destroyed Aldrun. However, because House Redoran believed in keeping the tradition of the Dunmer's Way of the Warrior alive, they would be able to organize a defense against the attacking Daedra, allowing them to protect the people of Morrowind. Not only this, but they would also be searching for a new safe haven for their people. We see this with the work of Brara Morvayn, who took over as councillor after her husband died from a corporous beast. Brara survived the destruction of Aldrun. She would then bravely take a group of Dunmer to Solstheim and negotiate for them to set up there, eventually taking over the island as it was gifted to them for their positive work that she had done. We also see the history of House Redoran that the house would manage to protect Morrowind in the wake of the Red Year, with them managing to also defend against the opportunistic attack of the Argonians, thus further protecting the civilians of Morrowind and cementing the idea that House Redoran cared about the Dunmer. With the enemies of House Redoran, if we consider both House Hlalu and the Third Empire, both of these groups were painted rather poorly after they were unable to protect Morrowind. Considering throughout the previous eras, House Hlalu used underhanded techniques to gain territory, along with other corrupt behaviors. This, coupled with their closeness with the Imperials and inability to protect Morrowind, would leave the Dunmer looking for someone to blame for the damage to their home from the Daedric invasion. So the people of Morrowind would turn to House Redoran, not only due to their traditional warrior spirit that would allow them to swiftly build an army to defend Morrowind, but also provide them with the ability to take care of the province afterwards. House Redoran would also be viewed favourably due to the actions of Brara Morvayn, who would establish a new home for many Dunmer outside of Morrowind, thus giving many Dunmer hope after watching the destruction that the Daedra would cause. House Redoran would not only give the Dunmer safety, but they would also give them hope and somewhere to rebuild after tragedy. Let me know in the comments if you would choose to support House Redoran. A special thank you to all of our Lore Archaeologist supporters. You guys help keep this channel running. And thank you to anyone who is joining our memberships. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one. It is about who exactly the Dunmer of the Elder Scrolls series are.